So welcome again, good afternoon to this third webinar of the BeST cycle about the application of behavioral sciences to tourism sustainability. Today we have our colleagues from Behavioural Insights Team that will lead us into a journey from knowledge to practice. We will look at a concrete example or a set of concrete examples of tourism sustainability, and in particular tourism flows management. And we will look at how behavioral insights and bespoke methodology of that applies behavioral insights can be used to help us manage this issue, this challenge. So you will see Claire and Alice, Claire Dale and Alice Escand will go through these steps of this methodology, and you will see how it can help also you in your own context. But before giving the floor to BIT, I would like to remind a couple of housekeeping elements. This webinar is being translated simultaneously into French. So for those of you who do not speak English, you can go in the bottom of your window and you will find an icon that allows you to select the French channel or the English channel. Also, you can ask your questions in either on the chat or in the question and answer section. You will have access to the recording of this webinar as well as the recordings of the former webinars. And my colleague Carla has shared on the chat some useful links about that. Maybe if Claire, you can switch to the next slide. Yes, I would like to say a couple of words about why we are organizing this webinar. Many of you already know, because many of you are not at their first webinar with us, but this is a webinar that takes place within Erasmus Plus project, which is called BeST, Behavior Smart Community for Tourism. And in this project, we are three partners. The project is led by Avitem, which is the Agency for Sustainable Mediterranean Cities and Territories. We are a cooperation agency based in Marseille. And then we have two top leading experts, let's say, on applied behavioral insights, which are the Behavioral Insights Team, and in particular the French office, but the Behavioral Insights Team is an organization with many antennas all around the world, and Behavior Smart, which is another organization based in Bulgaria, led by again behavioral experts that accompany destinations and other organizations in applying behavior smart tactics and interventions. So the BeST project aims to basically share knowledge and create a favorable environment to share knowledge about behavioral sciences applied to tourism. Actually, with these partners that we work with since a couple of years now, we have realized that there are many challenges related to tourism that are very closely linked to human behavior. Yet there is still a gap when it comes to applying the knowledge that exists about human behavior to these issues that are related to behavior. So the aim of BeST is to contribute to close this gap, this knowledge gap, by sharing really top-level knowledge from these experts through this cycle of webinars, but also by putting in place a living knowledge base with resources that will be made available to our community. And the second big goal of this project is to create a community of practice. So bring together the people that work in the tourism sector, that face these challenges, and that really start to see how important, how relevant it is to look at human behavior on one hand, and on the other hand, people that can bring this knowledge of applied behavioral insights and that can be also interested to apply their work to the tourism sector, which is really a field of experimentation that is quite unexplored for the moment. So I will just say a couple of words about the webinar cycle that we are organizing. You see that we are now at the third episode of our cycle of webinars. In the first webinar, again with BIT, we have had an introduction of the behavioral approach. We have made a journey into the human brain to see what happens when we take decisions and why it is relevant to know this when we shape and design public policies, public programs and services. In the second episode with Milena Nikolova from Behavior Smart, we have dived into the tourism sector and we have looked at many examples of how destinations and companies have been applying the knowledge about human behavior to solve an issue that they were facing. And in this webinar, we are going to go into the practical elements of how to apply in a correct way the behavioral approach. And we are teasing you and warmly invite you to join us for our fourth and last webinar on the 16th of March, when we will look at the future. We will look at the future challenges of the sector and how also future perspectives of how the human behavior, not only of visitors, but also of tourism actors more in general, can be better known and also mobilized to solve these future challenges. So maybe in the next slide we will see all the information related to this fourth webinar, and you have a QR code here already for the registration form, which has also been shared by Carla on the chat. So from my side, I think I've said everything. Again, do not hesitate to interact on the chat and on the question and answer, because this is going really to be a webinar that is supposed to be really interactive. So we will count on your active participation. Thank you again, and I will now leave the floor to Claire and Alice from BIT for the rest of the webinar.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julia, for this introduction. Yes, so as Julia said, the idea today is really to make this interactive. We are going to be walking you through the methodology that we at BIT use to try and think through, understand, and hopefully solve a few behavioral challenges. So we will be telling you about examples, running through a project to illustrate that. But the idea is also that you can make the most of this session by using the chat, the Q&A, the Slido. There's one coming up in a minute. We're no short of tools for you to be able to share your thoughts, experience, questions with us. There's also a dedicated Q&A slot at the end. So the presentation won't take up the whole of the session, so that we can reflect on experiences you may have, think through some challenges or changes that you'd like to see in your sector, issues around sustainability and tourism that you're interested in, and try and see if we can find a behavioral angle to it, answer your questions on how we would go about it methodologically to understand or do something about that issue. So the idea is really for you to, make the most of those tools and at the time we have together to ask us questions and, share also thoughts and reflections on this approach and challenges that you might face.
Sorry, very quickly, just because we have so many tools. For Zoom, we have both a Q&A function, but also the chat. If you can perhaps use the Q&A, if you have difficulty, just raise your hand and we'll let you chat, but so that we can monitor just a few of these tools. The Q&A is the favorite one. Thank you.
Yeah, Q&A is the place to be. Thanks, Alice. And so on our side, very much counting on you to be inputting, but on our side, what we will walk you through is our methodological approach, as I was saying. How do we go about applying behavioral insights to a real sustainable tourism challenge? We'll try and let you know a little bit about the different steps to identify and hopefully help solve a behavioral challenge. And lastly, find out about why and how we test behavioral interventions. As researchers, testing the ideas that we have, the interventions that we design based on the research that we do in the field is very much at the heart of what we do. And today we're going to tell you a little bit about why we do that and how we do it. So first, this will be running throughout. So in the Zoom Q&A, as Alice was saying, ignore my chat here. Do submit, a tourism challenge that you faced or a change you'd like to see or an experience you've had. As we walk you through the different steps of the methodology of how we go about approaching issues and solving them through a behavioral approach, do reflect on that and use the chat function as we go through, and then we will be monitoring it, answering questions as they come about or keeping them in, towards the end for the Q&A slot. So do make use of that. Okay. So have been going on about this methodology. What is it? At BIT, we've developed this in-house methodology that we use on our projects. The idea today is to run you through all the different phases of a project. We do have projects that only have a couple of those phases. We do have some that go through the whole thing. The idea today is to walk you through the whole methodology. We will be looking at an example for the first 3 phases that I will talk about in just a minute, that actually is not very representative of the projects that we usually do. It was a bit of a sprint, something that was done in a matter of days and not months, which is usually what we spend on those projects. The idea today was to use an example that was both relevant, we hope, to a lot of people on the line in the tourism industry, but also to showcase as clearly as possible the different steps. And we thought that using something that didn't take months and months and months to do and was difficult and long to do was hopefully a better, more helpful illustration of how we go about applying this on something that is relevant to the tourism industry. But we will be, Alice and I, walking you through each step of the way. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but the idea is that this methodology that we've called TEST goes through a series of stages that go from a very, very wide problem or something that you want to change, a solution, a challenge that you're facing, making that more specific, really narrowing it down to something that is a behavior, that is something that can be acted on, that is clearly behavioral at its core and not something that has a structural dimension. And I will talk to you a little bit more about what I mean by that. Go into a phase of field work, of research, which we'll go about, we'll tell you about in more detail in a minute, but to understand really what is causing the behavior or what is preventing it in the case of behaviors that you want to see happening. What are the key barriers, as we call them, to the behavior that you want to see happening? And we will talk to you, Alice will talk to you about the different tools that we have at our disposal to do that and understand what's really going on in the field. Then a phase of solution, which very much informed by what we find in the previous phase. What is going wrong? What are the barriers to your behavior? We design and develop innovative solutions to try and address that problem. These solutions will leverage what we know about the human brain, about behavior, and try and target as much as possible the key barriers that you found to have the most effective solution in place possible. And then, as I mentioned, at the heart of what we do as well is testing that. It's all good and well, and I hope we can convince you today of how robust these different steps are. But there's no knowing if what you think will work works until you've tested it. And so we will be telling you today a little bit about how we go about doing that, why we think it's so important, and what are the different tools that we can leverage to do that. The last stage is one that we usually accompany partners with, or that they carry on themselves, which would be kind of scaling up what it is that we found, adapting it if the results of the trial, mean that you have to tweak or change or let go completely of the intervention that you thought would be effective, and scale up what does work. Because once you have that evidence through testing of what works, you're in a much stronger position to be able to scale up interventions that are likely to succeed. Okay, so we will have a kind of a time to stop between kind of every phase so that people can, ask questions, and we can draw on questions in the Q&A if there are any relevant ones. So before we do that, I will just walk you through that first initial phase, the target phase. The objective of that is really, as it says on the slide, to define the goal of the project, what it is that you want to do, what the scope is, and identify measurable behaviors and outcome. So that's the difference between saying, I want to make tourism more sustainable, and saying, I want to encourage tourists to visit less frequently a specific site, or to visit at a time that's off-peak, or to use public transport when they are in a specific city. All of these are concrete, measurable behaviors and outcomes that respond to that bigger challenge of sustainable tourism, but they just kind of are at that bottom end of the funnel. It's about going from a very lofty, kind of overreaching goal to something that is a concrete behavior that we can kind of explore, understand, and hopefully encourage or discourage. So the way to do that really is a two-step process. The first one is to identify your overarching goal. What is it that you're trying to do? You can catch that in as simple terms as possible. I'm going in a minute to draw on, as I said, this short project that we ran on overcrowding, but it's it's identifying what it is exactly that you want to do. And then, as I said, kind of one step removed from that is trying to define something that's measurable, something that is clearly a behavior, and has measurable outcomes as well. So if we look at the example I was mentioning, you can even start one step removed from that. You could start from, I want to make tourism more sustainable in Florence. I want tourists, to have a more sustainable experience and to have less of an impact and so on the city that they're visiting. And so then there's a first stage of being like, right, that means a lot of different things. There's what does making tourism more sustainable in Florence means. It means changing tourists' behavior, but it also impacts other actors as well, such as kind of the city planners, but also kind of tourism professionals and so on. How and why do we focus on a specific behavior is really a matter of, I would say, in most of our projects, a matter of cooperation between different partners and so on. And we would always seek to understand kind of what are the key priorities, what will matter the most, what will have the biggest impact, what is also clearly something that is a behavior that can be changed, and not something more structural. We have often conversations with partners, for example, around mobility and kind of commuting or transport more generally. Indeed, choosing to get in your car is a behavior, and you can very much think that that's something to focus on and so on. But a lot of the time, the problem of like lacking infrastructure, for example, will mean that it's not really an option for you to do otherwise. And so is it really an impactful behavioral behavior to focus on if the infrastructure isn't in place to facilitate that behavior in the first place? So in that target phase, it's all about understanding the context, understanding what can be impactful, what can be actually acted on, narrowing it down so that it's a specific population that you're talking about. It's not just the lofty goal of making tourism more sustainable in Florence. It's acting on something more concrete than that. And just kind of going through a step-by-step approach to narrow it down to something that is going from an overarching goal to identifying different behaviors that would enable that goal, to going one step removed to identifying a concrete, measurable behavior whose change is impactful and feasible. So if we go back to that graph on the screen, you could have that category above, that's like making tourism more sustainable. And then a whole exercise of identifying through some tools that we've chosen not to show here for lack of time, but behavior maps, for example, to try and understand all the different actors at play, who does what, whose behavior is causing what impact, and so on. And then just kind of narrowing it down. So in this particular case, and Alice, we'll talk more about the project in more detail. But it was quickly identified that overcrowding was a key issue to focus on in Florence, just because of the sheer impact that would have, both in terms of the tourism experience, and a priority for kind of all of the different partners at stake. So the city, but also the tourism professionals and so on, and tourists themselves. Coming from that, what can we do once we've identified that goal of reducing overcrowding? Well, there's really two sets of behaviors that appeared as obvious ways to kind of act on that. Encouraging tourists to visit less well-known sites, that reduces overcrowding by redirecting tourists away from overcrowded sites, or encouraging them to visit well-known sites, but at low peak times, by spreading, obviously, in a longer amount of time, when people do visit the sites, you also act on mitigating overcrowding. But that's still, quite a broad objective, and it's not tangible in that, what does that mean? What am I looking at a specific site? How am I going to measure that? Will I know if what I'm doing has an impact on that? And so one step kind of further from that, which really depends as well on the data that you have available, on the partners that you can mobilize to help, on what you think is doable in the scope of a project. All of these things that we can talk about in more detail if people have questions on how you go about selecting that. But in this specific case, we ended up on this specific kind of tangible, measurable behavior of expanding the tourist footprint to reduce overcrowding in the most visited sites. I don't know, Alice, if you want to add anything on that. But... Great. So just to add a new tool, because we didn't have enough, we created a Slido for this so that people can, throughout the session, give us... Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. You know what? More technology is not always better technology. So much. Yeah, so we will keep an eye on it anyway, if people do use it, but we'd be very happy with the Q&A function in the Zoom. The idea is just to be able to nominate issues or a change that you'd like to see in your context, in your industry, in your city, and we can, have a think with you and try and see if we can find a behavioral angle to it. There's also your chance to challenge us and see if we can do it.
Okay, so we have, I'm seeing in the chat a few comments.
Yeah.
So the first is from Sinan Baran Bayar. The reporting of various software that measure the carbon footprint is very important. Maybe Sinan, can you expand on your point? If you are here and willing to tell us a bit more about this. Not? Okay.
I will maybe allow Sinan to speak because of course.
Oh, he's on. I think he's traveling. Okay, I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe we can come back to
okay, right. No problem.
But I don't know if it's a matter of knowing kind of what's impactful or not. So if it's about selecting behaviors on the basis of, this will have a bigger impact on making it more, or making, tourism more sustainable, or it will. So I don't know if the idea here is to be kind of, if you're considering a big overarching goal, like making tourism more sustainable, if one way to break it down, according to Sinan, is to look at the data and understanding that what would be the most impactful in terms of carbon footprint, or type of behavior to focus on. So for example, transport would be an obvious one, or actually like kind of what if food choices you make once you're at your destination. All of those we know are very big shares of, everyone's respective carbon footprint, and they don't go away when you're traveling, despite some of the biases that we've seen in our previous webinar about that. And so maybe it's about that. And I don't know if I'm misjudging that point, but.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So using these kind of tools also to help you select what behavior you can focus on that can have the most impact on your outcome. I'm seeing, so sorry, I have to get closer to the mic. I'm seeing another comment around carpooling. I think I saw that. I think it disappeared.
Agathe was also mentioning that, to be able to spread tourists on longer time periods, you need to have the accommodation for that. I think in the specific case, I was talking more about spreading them kind of throughout the day, which has its own challenges because people will want to do things according to their own schedule. But also we know, for example, in places like Florence, where it gets quite hot, people will tend to kind of flock to tourist sites kind of outside of those hours and so on. So definitely some issues in terms of organizing that and kind of trying to encourage visitors to see sites at different times during the day, and definitely a challenge if we're trying to think of encouraging them outside of, traditional tourist season. One big, obviously, structural barrier to that is school holidays. You can try and put the most inventive solutions in place to encourage families to go skiing. That's not a very good example because skiing will obviously very, very, very limited as well in time, but to go on holiday at your site at a different time. But school holidays will be there and will prevent, that change from happening probably on a big scale.
Yeah. So I have another comment from Sarah on how to encourage traveling by public transport or carpooling to a destination activity. I think that's a really good example of something very specific. Sarah, are you willing to tell us a little bit more about the context that you're in and why this is an objective of yours? If Julia, we can allow, I think it'd be great if
yes.
Yeah.
I'm just looking for Sarah. Just 1 second. She was in the list, but now I don't see her anymore. She was in the list of spectators, but I don't see Sarah anymore. Maybe Sarah, if you can, she has not Microsoft. Okay.
But she's running a nature-based activity, so there's not much public transport. So that's an interesting case where it would be an example. So before we would perhaps choose this as the main focus of our project, we would have to make sure that there is some alternative transportation. So if it's not public transport, is there some carpooling alternatives that are offered? And if they are offered, then that's something maybe where we could look at what are the barriers to people to choosing this mode of transportation, and what are the things that we can do to encourage people to carpool more to this activity if it is available. So that's a very good example. Are there any other examples that people would like to share on specific challenge? The carpooling website are not very much used. So I think that would be a good case actually for looking at why the service isn't used as much as maybe we would like to. And if there's something that we can do about it, and is it about communicating more? Is it about how we communicate about it? Is it about how accessible it is for people? So there's a lot of questions that can be asked from this kind of starting point. So we've had some examples on travel and mode of transportation. Is anyone facing a challenge where they would like to see some change of maybe tourists behaving differently on site, or even tourist sector people behaving differently, but how people behave on sites? I'm thinking waste management, but there are also other examples maybe that you
food choices.
Food choices.
Maybe while the spectators think, I can maybe mention an example in Florence where the mayor, the municipality at some point, they decided to forbid the fact to sit on the stairs in the UNESCO area, to sit on the stairs of monuments, or in general, to sit in places where that are not designed for people to sit, and to eat there. And in Florence, there is this habit to take a sandwich or a schiacciata, which is this typical sandwich, and eat it on the street. And so they had taken this measure of simply forbidding this practice in order to, of course, for waste management purposes, but also in general for, you know, to make the UNESCO area more livable, despite the big crowds of people.
Yeah,
thanks, Julia.
Good example. No other contributions? Oh, so Tatiana, I think we've also heard a little bit, so we have a bit of a context on you, I have to say the truth. So I know you've just arrived, but as we are talking about, you know, challenges people are facing and how to translate this into a sort of manageable behavior to focus, would you like to say a word on the challenge you are facing? If you just want to relax and sit down, that's also fine. Is she allowed to speak?
Yes, Tatiana, you should be able to speak. We are asking for this direct intervention because it's true that we know you had shared an example of an issue, right? But I can maybe be a Tatiana messenger. No, because it's true that it's an interesting question about how to sensitize, for example, the visitors of a region that faces problems of high heating and forest fires, how to sensitize people to avoid, for example, dropping their cigarette butts, or simply paying much more attention to that risk compared to other regions where this risk is less. And this is a reality in the south of France, for example. So I know that there are many questionings about this issue in the south of France in relation to fire risk. Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Great. So maybe we can move on, but I think that's a really interesting kind of question to think about of how you would specifically pinpoint kind of like, it's not the cause of your challenge, but like why is this challenge happening, and down to specific behavior. Usually we say, of course, it's not exhaustive, but we can look at either you know, how people behave on site, so what they do around the choices they make around food, around waste, or around heating and sobriety and all of that. Or we can look at movements and flux, so how people move, so more the decisional around where they go and how they travel. So these are, for example, two broad categories to think about of like, do I want to see a change in the flux of people, or do I want to see a change in the kind of content of what they're doing? Yes, Julia?
No, I was just mentioning that Tatiana has also shared the same observation on the chat, but it's okay.
And actually that just brings an interesting point that it's not always the tourist behaviors that we would like to change. And I think sometimes it's easy to kind of point others and the blame. But there is also a kind of system change that is needed for this big issue. And that also that goes with changing the behavior of the actors in the system. So for example, the tourism sector industry, and here Tatiana is thinking of restaurant owners, tour operators, camping owners, and things like that. And that's also a very interesting also angle. Great. Should we?
Yeah.
Move on? Yeah. Okay. Every time I want to move on, there's an interesting comment on the chat. But I think that's a very good and very relevant point Carla is making about ski station.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of change that some people would like to see around, you know, what types of activity people do when they go to the mountain, and is there something that we need to adapt to? But there's, of course, a lot of resistance to, you know, doing something that maybe you've always done or that you're very attached to. So I think these issues of like changing also the expectations and the norm of what is possible on site is also a big issue that the mountain world is facing.
Yeah, and as you said, I think it goes back to that point as well of thinking through system change and all the actors as well, because at a recent sustainability tourism event that Julia and I were at together, really interestingly had some insights into kind of qualitative research that had been done by not a ski operator, kind of a more like broadly like mountain operator, into like what are the main reasons that people do go to the mountain. And actually there was a lot about that was around enjoying nature, being in nature, being outside, seeing the scenery and so on. And so yes, there is that attachment to, you know, those activities that might not be very sustainable, like skiing as it exists today in some resorts, with, you know, the artificial snow that we have to create and the impact it has and so on. But, you know, a reason against kind of more broad change than what we're seeing at the minute might not just be what tourists want to do and what they're ready to change and what they're ready to accept and so on, but what kind of professionals in the sector itself is ready to embrace this change and the widespread kind of repercussions that has for the economic models in place and the ways that the kind of seasonality of the kind of mountain exploitation and so on is turning into. So again, just kind of going back to Alice's point, not always just thinking about how tourists have to change or that it's their behavior that's at stake, but trying to understand if we have this objective of making tourism more sustainable, that it's also a systemic issue and that behavior change has to happen at lots of different levels for that goal to be reached.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. So let us move on to the second part of the kind of project chain. Can you hear me well? Yeah. So let's say that now we have a bit of an issue well defined. So whether that is, you know, to reduce at-risk behaviors inside to avoid, like, let's say, forest fire, or whether that is to change the mindset of people going to the mountain and broaden their horizon of what there is to do, or if whether that is, you know, like in the Florence example that we're talking about, changing, try to influence where people go and try to try to have the less well-known site more known to people. We have to do this phase of trying to understand the context and what's going on. So in this explore phase, there are kind of three main goals. So as I said, the first is really to understand the context. And by context, we also means the different constraints that people face, whether that is also structural constraints sometimes, but also the kind of the system that they insert themselves in. So who are the different stakeholders, and also how do they influence the behavior of the end users? We are looking most importantly at what we're going to call the barriers. So what are the obstacles that impede us to see the behaviors that we want to see? So if we take the example of increasing the demand for mountain activities that don't require snow, why are people really hanging on to this idea of ski, and what is preventing them from wanting this or in the case of Florence, and I'll show you what we did also, understanding why are people not going to see the other sites outside of the main square. So we're here focusing on the barriers, and there are different types of barriers. There will be informational barriers, so things that I know or things that I don't know, and that's usually the type of barriers that people can think about first. But there are also other types of barriers. Sometimes there are psychological barriers. Sometimes it's an attachment, it's emotional, it's something about motivation. So those are more psychological types of barriers, and other types endlessly. So like risk, how I perceive the risk of my behavior, how others influence me, or like how my environment more broadly can influence me. The third kind of goal of our Explorer is very linked to this diagnostic of barriers, is to understand then what are the levers at my disposals to be able to lift those barriers, but not just the levers, but also what are the touch points? And by touch point, it's a bit jargony, but it just means the people involved in the systems that can be used to communicate an information or to be an agent of change. So identifying the idea is to have this kind of big map to understand the behaviors and what's causing the behavior or not the behavior. So the types of activity that we can use in Explore, we've summarized them in this acronym that says LEAD. So there is listen, experience, ask, and data analysis. So usually we think of listen and ask, and those are the most widely used, and they're very, very good base. So in listen and ask, we can use surveys to kind of get an understanding of the issues, and as I mentioned, also to get a sense of what are the main barriers that people are facing. Listen would also be around surveying these people, but it can have a more qualitative component. So you just use these surveys, but we can have very in-depth conversation with people. So this is more broadly around listening to what people say that they do, but also a really interesting part of understanding the overall context is to observe what actually people do. So this would be through first-hand experience. So for example, going to the site and experiencing yourself, what it feels like to, I don't know, be a tourist or to use different types of activity. And maybe you will have insights here that you haven't thought of before. And also analyzing the data. So when we say data, sometimes there are actual data, let's say flux data or others, but also we can look at data in the literature and what, researchers have looked at everything. So probably on one issue, there will be some papers that, have looked at this issue and have something interesting to say. So we use these different methods to help us map out this very comprehensive picture of our behavior. To give you a very practical example, so we were on this, a tourism in Florence examples where after some discussion, we choose to focus on expanding the tourism footprint outside of the main area. So what we did, again, as Claire said, we did in one afternoon something that would probably usually take us months to do, but even that was already a good, it helped us to get new insights. So just to say that, and something I should have mentioned, it's not because you don't have to do all the 4 leads. This is obviously in a dream world, but even doing a bit of research is going to help you compared to not doing any research. So what we did in the context of this workshop is that we said to everyone, all the participants, even if they were tourism sector experts and have worked in this industry for years, and it's not to undermine this experience, but to say, okay, let's for an afternoon just try to be tourists. And so we sent them in 3 different main sites in Florence. So for those who know Florence, we had the Uffizi Gallery, the Duomo, and the Palazzo Vecchio, so not the worst place to do field work. So we sent them to these different places, and we had 2 tasks for them. So the first was this interview guide, so listen and ask questions about how they make decisions, where they get the information, why they're here, etc., etc. And the second was also an observation exercise. So we had maps that we drew, and we asked people to kind of draw where the crowds and where the lines of people were, to see if there was interesting insights for those. And just as I won't, tell you all about the different insights that we got, but for example, from this observation exercise, one interesting insight that we got is that we realized that people were lining where the shades was. And so that gave us interesting ideas of like, why don't we do a map of places where we can have cool air, or where we can avoid the sun and etc. So you can have kind of insights and ideas coming from this. So now we also want to give you back the microphone and hear about your experience, and for any of the challenges that you were mentioning, have you run any kind of research? And by research, I mean very in a large sense, activities, so that can just be speaking to tourists or running surveys, reading some papers, or even looking at data, any of these activities to try to help you understand the challenge and try to get at, okay, why do people actually don't do this, or actually very stick to doing this, even though they should be doing something else? Would anyone like to share any either activities that they've run, or just that they read some interesting work done on this?
I mean, whilst we wait for, we realize that we're really putting you on the spot and asking you to think through some tasks and activities that might not be what you do most of the time. But really to emphasize what Alice was saying, that it doesn't have to be a 4-month-long in-depth field trip, but more kind of understanding if you've had the experience, and if not, why not? And if, do you think that you would be more interested in doing an afternoon of putting yourself in the tourist shoes, or in running a survey with your employees on a specific tourist destination? We're interested in those insights as well. And if you're not interested in that, or think that it's not a good idea, we're also interested in hearing that as well. But whilst we give a chance to everyone to reflect, maybe useful for us to just tell you very quickly about broadening it a little bit away from tourism. But for example, we work on quite a lot of projects where we seek to understand why people who are eligible for a benefit, or for applying for something, whether it's to get their house insulated, kind of more energy efficient, or applying for unemployment benefits and things like that, why don't enough people do it? And that will be something where your expertise as someone who works in that field and so on will be invaluable. But actually trying to go onto the website, open it, and apply for the benefit will also be a huge source of insights in terms of understanding, maybe it crashes, maybe putting all the documents is a pain, maybe there are glitches or things like that. And then speaking to people who are eligible and understanding why they're not doing it, even if it's not for a 6-month-long period, will give you hugely valuable insights as well. Is it psychological barriers, like Alice was mentioning earlier? Is it that they didn't know about it, and then that means you have to act on the communication aspect of it as a solution? All of those are worthwhile activities to get just different perspectives on the same problem. No, maybe
yeah. Okay, Nathan's contribution from Canada's Behavioural Science Team. That's great. Data collection. You generally have structured qualitative approach when you do observational work, or is it more open-ended? I think it really depends on the topic. So we like, in general, but this is kind of our approach, to always have some sort of qualitative insights, because we've found that we can learn a lot from survey, but at the stage where what we need to learn is very granular and sometimes very subtle, it's more in the psychology and the emotional parts of it, we found that at least having some qualitative insights that can complement the quantitative is very useful. And that's where we get a lot of insights for intervention phase as well. In some cases, we have observational work. We don't do it often. I think there are, sometimes ethical concerns of observing people. Sometimes it's not always relevant. But for example, as Claire was saying, even just the experiential work of trying to, go through a service yourself is really helpful to understand, especially, for example, digital interventions and services like this, to yourself be able to understand the friction points and where things are difficult, can be very helpful.
Yeah. Just looking at the time, maybe we need to move on a bit.
Okay, so this was the kind of data collection phase of things. So the way that we usually do it is that once we have a bit of a material on from these interviews or from these observations or other types of and methods, we need to make sense of it, and we need to make sense of it in a way that will help us design good interventions. So what we then do is that we have different types of model that we can use. Honestly, there are a million different models, and it really kind of has to adapt to the needs of the project. But just for today, we'll show you two that can be useful in your own research. So what we have found useful in tourism research is breaking down the information in terms of user journey. So user journey, maybe some of you are familiar with it, maybe not everyone, but it's simply to break down in small steps what can lead you all the way to a behavior and what happens before and after. So if I take, for example, the Florence example, we were really focusing on this part of when they visit, okay, how do we get them to expand their horizon of what to visit? But we thought to be able to understand this very well, we need to understand also what happens before and what happened after. So the way that we broke down this kind of process and this journey of the tourist in 4 steps. So the first would be planning. So this is the phase, and it doesn't always happen, but it can happen for some tourists, where you think about where you want to go and you make plans. It can be just on the day of, or it can be months in advance. It depends on the people, but where you decide where you will go. There's the phase where you arrive in a place and you see, you have the environment around you, but this is the first kind of entry point. Then the visiting stage. And then after that, you leave the sites. And so why do we have these 4 steps? Is that it allows us to do 2 things. One is to be able to map out barriers that can happen at each stage of this process. For example, at planning, maybe I don't have all the information, so I cannot make the choice of going to the less well-known site. At arriving, I only get, this 1 arrow that tells me to go there, so I don't feel like I don't really have a choice. I'm just illustrating. And visiting, why are then people just staying there and not going other places? And when they leave, because they leave, but maybe they go somewhere else after, why are they not going to these sites? So this is mapping the barriers on this journey, but also identifying interesting, as I said, like those touch points, but also interesting opportunities for intervening. So you can intervene at the place where they get their planning information. So I don't know if people visit, website or tourist advisor or any, or the Office de Tourisme or all of these places, maybe that's a point for intervention. Arriving is very important. This is what do you see when you arrive? And what does the information tells you? Maybe there are some intervention that can happen there. When they leave, I'll lump in visiting and leaving, but when they visit and then they leave, is there then information that you can have at this point that can pinpoint you to go to other sites? So this is one way to use this, make sense of the data. Another that you will present is it's less focused on the journey than on a kind of a behavioral model. So there are a lot of different behavioral models, and they have to be used with caution as well, because they are models and not necessarily reality. But one model that we use quite frequently, because it's been made by a consensus of scientists working in behavior science, is the COM-B model. And I won't go into the details. I'm really happy to talk about it later, but just to tell you that this model exists. And this model states that in order for someone to do a behavior, change a behavior, they need to have the motivation to do it, the capability to do it. So this is in a broad sense, but you can understand it with like physical, psychological capability. So knowledge, for example, would go in there. And the opportunity to do them. So they need to be in an environment that facilitates the behavior. So just to give concrete examples, so that's just not words. If I want to go and explore other sites, and my motivation need to be there. So a barrier could be like, I don't want to see, I don't want to miss out on the must see. So this is what I'm going to prioritize. On the more capability or knowledge category, maybe I don't even know those options, so I cannot even make that choice. On the opportunities, maybe actually this is a structural problem and I don't have like public transport or easy mode of transportation that can get me there. So this is very basic and illustrative, but the idea is just to show you that we can also sort the data with these models in order to help us first understand where's the biggest kind of bottleneck and what is the issue that we need to resolve. For example, if it's a knowledge issue, maybe that's the first thing where we should start. And also to give you ideas of interventions after. Is Julia? Oh, no.
Sorry, it was a mistake.
So I'll just continue, but don't hesitate to ask other questions. So from these insights that we have gathered on the different types of barriers, we take this into our solution phase, and we try to mix two things, is these insights from the field, but also that's also a phase where now we're going to draw on the literature and see, are there any other studies in behavior science that have looked at this and that's can tell us what could be effective or not. And this is where we can have intuitions of certain types of intervention that would work better. For this, there are a lot of different ways to go about it. But what we have found helpful in some cases and for some of our partners, especially when you're not that so familiar with behavior science, is to follow some types of solution frameworks. So the one I'm presenting here is a framework developed by the Behavioural Insights team that's called BeST, and it's meant to be very kind of simple and easy to use. And it states that for any interventions that you are developing, it's in order to be the most behavioral, quote unquote, possible and the most effective possible, it has or it should follow these principles of being easy, attractive, social, and timely. So there's a report available, by the way, so you can look at some details. And I won't necessarily go into the details of every of these things, but just to say that in this phase where we really ask ourselves, okay, what do we do and what interventions do we put in place? We can use and rely on some of these frameworks, at least to give us a direction of where to go, with also the insights from the field. So just to give you some examples of two categories so that it's maybe a little bit more concrete. So when we say easy, it's quite self-explanatory, but really it's important to make the behavior, the change, the easiest possible. Every friction might kind of deviate, or you might lose people there. Make it attractive. That can mean a lot of different things. That can mean always in the context of tourism, that can mean attracting attention in specific places, so placing a footprint or having this kind of visual cues to orient behavior where people go. But attractive can also be used in a sense of using incentives. So thinking about motivational incentives. So it could be financial incentives, but not always. You know, like you might perhaps seen in those cafes, like those cards where you punch and then you have some kind of rewards after. It can be financial, it can be, again, something else. You win something that doesn't have a lot of monetary values, but that you still value. So this is a way to make it attractive. So make it social. I think there's also a lot of way to make it social, but it's very important to think about the social aspects, or you know, do you see that other people are doing a similar thing? Do you leverage on networks and friends and families and things like that to make this intervention efficient? And two examples of timely. So thinking in depth about what is the timing of the information that you provide. And, you know, it doesn't have the same effect when you provide information at different time. So maybe, you know, thinking about when people are in line, bored, is it a good time to maybe, you know, show them some new information, for example? But also in timely, we can put, you know, helping people to plan better. So again, so this is an example of a graph telling you when is the least busy time to visit a site. So this is the type of information that we give to people so that they can plan their day better and say, okay, maybe I will go, you know, in the morning, there seems to be less people. So this timely has all these elements as well. So as I said, you kind of put all these elements in the big pots. And then there's no kind of like secret or step-by-step process to do it, but we usually like to do it in consultation, in close co-creation with stakeholders and sometimes users as well. So this is an example in Florence, where we had a kind of big brainstorming session. It was actually at one point in time, but also throughout the whole project, so that we allowed ideas to pop up, even though, you know, during the explore phase or others. And then, as you can see on the right, we also had the East to guide people. And we came out with a very long list of solutions that were both addressing the elements we saw in the diagnostic, but also leveraging on some of the behavioral principles. So I won't go through all of them, but when I looked at them, I saw there were some good ideas that we found. So, you know, they range from these ideas of developing these kind of using humor hate guides, so this series of guides for people who hate the sun or people who hate art. So wanting to be a bit provocative, and proposing a different view of Florence. We had this reflection on using queue time to provide alternatives. The ideas of maybe having some incentives like lottery tickets to get free tickets to a randomly selected location. How we can help people to plan better and have this personalized planning. So tell me who you are and what you like, and I can give you some personalized advice. What else have we got? This idea of the heat, and maybe can we, you know, show a kind of a freshness, a path of museums and things like that to help people be both cool and also visit other sites. So we had this long list, and then through a process again of selection. So there's a lot of criteria that goes into it. So there's obviously what actually is feasible, because usually when we do that list, it's a bit of a wish list, and there's a lot of things that won't necessarily be feasible to implement. There's this aspect, but there's also, of course, what we think could have a big impact, what would be important for people, etc., etc. So we have those criteria, and we go from a long list to a short list. And the idea here is that even though we had different types of ideas, they're not necessarily just ideas on their own, and they can be combined also in one type of kind of mega idea, if you wish. So for the Florence example, we particularly liked these kind of 4 ideas of these alternative guides to show Florence in a different light. This idea of motivating a different way to see the city, and I'll show you how we did this visually. This idea of helping provide personalized planning information, and I didn't talk about it, but it's kind of our key touch points is also using the landing page of the Wi-Fi Florence to highlight key information. So when you go to Florence, there's free Wi-Fi, and you can go and log in, and it takes you to a landing page where it's for at the time it was blank, and we thought this could be also an interesting way, interesting place, to have those different guides. So after this idea, we think it's important to very quickly get to a prototype. So what do we mean by a prototype is kind of any sort of mocking up the intervention, even if it's just a paper thing, or it's a drawing, or it's on the internet and it's not the full thing, but that kind of represents a sort of minimum viable product, if that speaks to some people. But really the idea is to mock up the concept very fast and get them in front of some users to get some insights before we build the whole thing and then realize that was really not adapted. So in this case, we just built a very quick mock-up with, screenshots and screenshots to, show what the landing page looked like and what the types of content could be in this landing page. So as I said, we had the alternative guide, the personalized planning tool, the games and quizzes. So I'll show you what some of the prototypes were. So this is an example of a very pop style, flashy of the hate guides, where we had I hate the sun, but I love shadows. And it was a tour of all the different places that were with some information of whether it was sunny or shadow at what time. We had some different alternative guides. So here we mixed a bunch of different ideas. For example, what was highlighted in the map was actually not the usual sites. We highlighted like the less well-known sites, and we left blank the most well-known site to kind of reverse the perception of what is actually a must-see. And in that, we had this mascot, so Galileo, showing us different sites with some games and quizzes. Follow me, spin the wheel, and find some places to promote. So yeah, just to finish on that, we didn't do it for Florence, but the idea would have to if we wanted to continue to take it to some users, get some sort of insights, and then from that go on to a test phase. And Claire will tell you a bit more about the test phase. But maybe we'll stop because I've talked a lot.
And I think that Tatiana, wanted to react or.
Oui, bonjour. Vous m'entendez bien?
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me well? It's very difficult to not see everyone, but no worry about that. I just wanted to give a bit of feedback about what I was writing in the chat. Very sorry. Just ask you to bear with me for a second. Sorry about that. I was talking about the droughts, the very dry conditions that we have in the Var region of the south of France. It's a real problem for us. We have been in drought conditions since October 2022. We've had a lot of local government orders, hose pipe bans, for example, car washing bans, and so on. And the weather is fine at the moment, which is good for some people, but there are a lot of restrictions on water use. So in our territory, there's a big, the Dressenny area, there's been a big publicity campaign, a big communication campaign focusing on bus stops and other types of communication methods. Tourist offices were involved as well. But the question I have is, what would be the impact for a tourist or a local person seeing all of this information about the drought? A lady came to visit us, Emma, Aziza, who is a hydrologist and who does a lot of lectures and appears on television talking about droughts. And she came to hold and host an information meeting on climate change and drought. We've had some awareness raising initiatives in schools at all levels, from primary through to the top of secondary school. We've been raising awareness on all sorts of levels, but as a director general of the municipal services for a town near Draguignan, I'm wondering about how effective this information is. The information is everywhere. I think people are forgetting it because, you know, there's lots of advertising around. People see advertising everywhere, and despite the really large scale awareness raising campaign, I think it's going to be necessary to think about how we work with Airbnb hosts, hotels and tourism promoters. I think we need to think about the capability of tourists or their hosts to change behaviors. We've got a lot of municipalities in the higher areas of our territory which have got no water left. There's massive water shortages in some of the areas. It's very worrying. I'm worrying on a personal and a professional level about this issue, and I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tatiana.
Oui, après, je comprends l'anglais, pas de problème, merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois que vous pouvez vous mettre sur le canal français, de toute façon.
You can always go onto the French channel if you wanted to. You can choose whichever.
Thanks a lot, Tatiana, for sharing that with us. What I find really, really interesting in what you're saying is obviously the scale of the challenge, how pressing it is as well, but also how you've thought through all the different people whose behavior needs to change for the situation around water shortages to get better. At the same time, it's amazing that you're thinking about all those people, but definitely kind of reaching these different people will require different tools. And it goes back to that point of touch points as well that Alice was mentioning. But, maybe a campaign on buses or in other kind of public transport, as you say, gets mixed up with other types of publicity, and it's not the most effective way to communicate that. It's obviously not going to be the same if you want to reach tourists who we know have a tendency to also behave differently when they're on their holidays, when they're away from home, and they don't have, they don't see necessarily the material impact of their actions. They also might not care as much. As you say, you were saying, I'm concerned professionally, I'm concerned personally. It's where you live, you're concerned about that. As a tourist, I might not share that concern. I might also not know that, what my behavior is having such a detrimental impact. Hotels, Airbnbs, as you mentioned, all have a role to play. How do we reach them? How do we identify what the best touch point is, as Alice was saying earlier? And that kind of comes from the field, from the research. We'd have to look into it more to understand, how do we reach these people? What is the information that is missing? Is it that people don't know about kind of how urgent the water shortage situation is? With the new regulations that have come into place, probably, they do know, but do they know what to do? Do they know concretely, like what actions they have to take? What is impactful, what is not? Are they willing to do it? Does the kind of cost to themselves and the effort they have to put in outweigh, the benefits that they see from doing it? And again, that will be very different for locals and people who are kind of invested in the local community to tourists, maybe. But so no simple answer. And again, both kind of how you communicate that and what you communicate will be really important, and how you adapt that to each person will be really important. And without, kind of having seen that big campaign and understanding how it was deployed, what was emphasized and so on, it's a bit difficult to give more kind of concrete insights to you, but I don't know if Alice, you wanted to add
Yeah,
something.
yeah, no, I think you made some very good points. Well, thanks for sharing, Tatiana. You can see it's very close to your heart.
Definitely.
I think also what I'm picking up that I find interesting in your intervention is that we see the limit of communication. So we are kind of over solicited nowadays with tons of information, and from the public, from the private, from the advertisement, etc., that tells us what to do. And so we can feel sometimes if there's almost this saturation of information, and on other projects we have people telling us like, I can't hear another, hearing of another threat, or this is, and they kind of shut down to these kind of alarmist kind of tone. And I think what would be interesting also to look in your case is that behavior science isn't always just communication. It can also be looking at the environment that people make decision in. And is there any way that we can change this environment so that the easiest choice is the good choice? So the easiest choice would be the choice that protects, water usage or everything. And that can be, sometimes a change of environment and individually, but that can also be a change of the environment at the level of the system. Maybe that means that some actors in the system need to change something so that they make it easy for the user to do the right choice. So how can we facilitate again making the right decision? Because it's not always easy. There's tons of barriers that can go in the way, but if the easiest we can make, and the more likely we have for people to do it, but sometimes that demands change for other people in the actor. Yeah. Olivier, you have a hand raised.
Yes, Olivier, I think you can simply unmute and speak.
Merci. Alors, moi, je suis Olivier Calousdian. Je suis à Marseille.
I am Olivier Calousdian. I am in Marseille. I founded a company a few years ago which aims to build a sustainable tourism site. We've been talking a lot about this since 2018, but we're talking about starting with a blank page, starting with greenfield sites, so that we are low carbon. And so we build everything in terms of the carbon footprint, in terms of accommodation, energy, water treatment, mobility, etc. So that's just to summarize what we're doing. So hi to Tanya and Julia, who I know. I just wanted to say, sorry, this is the first webinar that I've been with you, so I may not have fully understood the subject of today. So if I'm too broad, my apologies, but I wanted just to respond to what you were saying about mountains. And there is a problem here, but we've been taking part in the Sustainable Tourism Committee and working on this area of how to make tourism less impactful. And there's a number of tourism tools that have been adapted over the years. And so there are places, for example, in Val de Drôme, where there's no more snow in ski areas. So there's a whole load of activities with karting and bikes and things like that, which people are going down the slopes in other ways. And that's attracting a lot of people, but it's not the same as skiing. And then you also talked about overcrowding. The Calanques in Marseille, for example, have now been limited for overcrowding with registration required on the internet. And that's a very good thing. And the town hall was very concerned about the response of people, but actually people are really very happy about this limitation for access. And then it's similar for the Porquerolles Islands. It's a bit more complicated to do the limitation here because it's a private company that does the shuttle boats across. But on this island, smoking is forbidden. Tatiana was talking about cigarette butts, etc. But we have about 90% compliance on these islands. So prohibitions do work. The same thing there's also the same thing for water, because there's no water on the Porquerolles Islands. Water has to be sent over in a barge. So there's always been these limitations from a number of years, but it's people enjoy going there. And then I want to talk about behavior. We know the South Paca region very well and the historical tourism operators here. We can't say that they do they're putting a lot of effort into changing in terms of water leakage, abusive energy consumption, whether it's sort of standard operators or even with Airbnbs. I know that with Tatiana, we can find spas and saunas in Airbnbs, which are rather concerning, I think. So I think what needs to happen is we need to see changes that come from top down, because if we propose really sustainable development options, that doesn't mean that there isn't a high level of comfort, but using virtuous architecture. Customers are ready for that. They're ready to use solar power. They're ready to know that the water they use will be recycled and filtered. They're ready for a natural swimming pool, even if there are some lilies and a few insects in it. They're ready to leave their vehicle behind if we give them an electric car or a bike to move around the area. These are the kind of things that we're trying to do in the South Paca region. So I just wanted to express that really. Thank you, Olivier. I think what you said, there's some really interesting things there. Also, it's worth noting the different kinds of incentives. We can talk about these kind of harder incentives, if you can call it that, these prohibitions. So sometimes, if it's possible, sometimes that's better. So if we want to reduce access to a particular site or the calanques, if it's possible to put in place a prohibition or to put in place this kind of hard incentive, that's obviously going to be a good thing. And it's obviously often very effective. Of course, it's not always possible to do this. It's not always possible to regulate behavior. Sometimes there can be more subtle things like the use of water in particular contexts.
Oh, sorry, I'm in French. Désolé. Should I switch in English? Okay, sorry, this is very confusing. So when you cannot have this strong kind of incentives oh, I cannot speak English, interdiction. I think you understood me. Then that's interesting to think, okay, what are the softer incentives that I can have at my disposal to still kind of encourage this behavior, but without having to resort to an interdiction or other. So just to kind of correct that, we're not saying we shouldn't take hard measures in some cases, and in the environment, sometimes that is the best thing to do. But it cannot, unfortunately, be always applied to everything.
Yeah, and there's a dimension as well of what is going to be accepted. And I know, Olivier, you mentioned, that there was apprehension in the mayor's office about kind of banning or like limiting the access to calanques. I'm not surprised that went down quite well for quite a few reasons. One, a lot of people, a lot of tourists are attached to that kind of scenery that we have and want to protect it and so on. They also want to enjoy themselves and probably enjoy themselves more when there are fewer people on site. And also, if you don't sign up, then you can't go in, and there are controls and so on. So there's things that mean that that kind of ban, that kind of move can really function. On other kind of pro-environmental behaviors, where maybe the cost to yourself or the effort that you perceive you have to put in is big, and there's no way of really controlling. So, for example, when there are bans or limits on how much water you can use, or that you're not supposed to fill in your pool or wash your car, that really depends, and it can be really well accepted if people really buy into what's at stake and understand the emergency of the situation and so on. It can also backfire depending on what the communications around they are. If there are controls in place, for example, if you really underline the risk that you take, that there's a financial sanction or something like that if you go against the rules, and actually there's no kind of control, surveillance, or anything that the behaviors are being upheld, that might then backfire, because actually people will think, oh, I can do this and be off the hook, it doesn't matter. So there's really like not one size fits all kind of answer. But I think what you were saying, Olivier, was really interesting as well, because it goes back to also what Alice was saying about making the behavior as easy as possible. And that sometimes means going really far back in the chain and going to all those different actors you mentioned, so that the options available to me, consumer, tourist, and so on, are the options that are kind of sustainable. And, I think in that kind of, we're going back full circle and, agreeing that it's all about trying to create that environment, and also not focusing, again, as Alice was saying earlier, just on the behavior change at the tourist level, and really seeing, that as an ecosystem and understanding all the different actors and how they also need to change. And in that mountain example you were giving, Olivier, going back to what we were saying earlier, the economic incentives might be something that's preventing change towards more sustainable activities, even though tourists, as you say, are willing to change themselves. Okay,
should we breathe?
We're out of time, and realize that we want people to be able to chat still some more, but yeah, difficult. I will breeze us through the test phase. If there are any kind of specific questions, we're happy to address them. The idea here is not to give you a crash course in how to run quantitative evaluations of interventions that you might run, but just to give you a taster of why we think it matters to test those things that we think will work, and to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. So just a very quick example as to why it matters. Sometimes you will kind of generate interventions and messages in particular that you think will be effective, and you think they will be effective to kind of encourage the behavior you want to encourage, because the literature will maybe tell you so. You will have seen in kind of other examples that it works, and so on. You will think that it's a convincing way of presenting the information. And if you just roll it out, you might go terribly wrong. And one way of avoiding that is to test what it is that you think will be effective. If you can, compare it with other things to see what is most effective, and kind of in that way prevent backfiring effects. Very quickly, this was an example at a national park in the US, where a team of researchers was seeking to understand how we could discourage visitors from taking fossilized wood from the site, which was obviously detrimental to the petrified forest, because it was petrified wood that people were taking. And they tested different messages. I'm not going to go into the methodology of how they did that, because we're out of time unless there are specific questions, but they managed to make it random enough so that at different sites in the park, you would see different messages and so on, and they were able to compare by marking on the wood and then counting how much wood was taken, which messages were more effective. And it turned out that when they were emphasizing the message that you see on the right, what other people were doing by trying to discourage people from taking wood, they actually led to people taking more wood than they would if they saw kind of other messages. Testing matters. If you hadn't tested, and if you'd roll that out, you probably would have led, you patted yourself on the back, thought, I did some really great work here, and actually led to kind of worsen the behavior that you were trying to discourage. And so that's why it matters to test. You find out what works. You probably will have a limited budget or limited time at least, and you can't do everything. So you find out what works that way. You measure, you compare results so that you can quantify that and understand really what's working. And you mitigate risks, as we saw in the previous slide, just making sure that what you do actually helps and doesn't hinder the objective that you set out to tackle in the first place. Okay, I don't know if we have a lot of time for this. Anyway. Happy to talk about this some more. You can quiz us on some on how we evaluate projects, but the idea really is just to give you an overview of the different ways in which we can evaluate. And here, really, what we see as kind of the golden standard when we can is to have some quantitative research that randomizes groups and so on, and make sure that we have very robust evidence on what works and what doesn't. But that doesn't mean that you need to turn into a quantitative researcher to be able to get first insights and test out, things that you might be developing and putting into use in the field. There's other ways that you can do that. And, even kind of, as we said, speaking to people, doing that qualitative research, yourself trying out things, all of that will give you insights into whether what you think works, whether it works or not. And I'm sorry that we've breezed through this. There's a lot more to say about evaluation, but I think in the sake of time, just to say that, the idea today was to give you a very quick tour of the methodology that we use to try and understand, identify, other way around, identify, understand, and solve, hopefully, behavioral challenges. But, where do we go from here? What can you do about it? Well, the good news is that the journey doesn't stop here. There is a fourth webinar that Julia mentioned at the start to kind of complete this series and take you kind of one step further in the reflection of how behavioral insights can be applied to solve these kind of challenges. But beyond that, we also have kind of the whole BeST project and its objectives around building a community of practice, as Julia mentioned at the start, making sure that, you can share experience, insights, and so on of the kind we've had today, but on a broader and kind of longer term scale. A website that will kind of continue to grow, to share knowledge and to share kind of best practice with case studies, examples, and so on, but also a network of people. And, if you have a behavioral challenge that you want to solve, or if there's something that you think could benefit from kind of that kind of expert support, there are people, like Behavior Smart, people like BIT, and so on, who kind of work in that and are part of that network now to try and kind of further that reflection as well. Okay, and I might just give you back the mic, Julia, or I don't know if we have to end here because we're all out of time, or if we can take a couple questions.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much for this. Yes, it's true that we have run a little bit out of time, but I think it's also good that we have had active participation from you who have been watching. So you will. I'm again putting the link to the next webinar. We have this LinkedIn group, the LinkedIn page, the Twitter channel. So everything is going to be being shared on the chat. I know that there is not a lot of time left. If any of you has any burning question, maybe please raise your hand and be very, very, very short. Otherwise, in any case, you will have access to the recording and to the presentation of today, and we are at your full disposal to answer further questions. Our contact details are accessible from the website and from the slide. So I think that now we can then close this very, very insightful webinar. A big thank you to Claire Dale and to Alice Scan, which gave us such a high quality journey into this test methodology. I hope that you who followed, you found insights from your own work. And so we give you the next appointment on the 16th of March for our fourth webinar and on our social media channels. Thank you to everybody, and until next time.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks, everyone.